Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We're going to start a lecture on what's called the Green Revolution and GMOs, which we've already talked about. Please enjoy this picture of a giant tortoise and a horse. Yay. All right, so I'm starting with a fun fact about Miss Kennedy. I used to work on a farm in Brooklyn. This was me in college, harvesting some stuff from the farm. And just chilling. And it's in Brooklyn, it's in Canarsie, right? Really close to Tilton High School, actually. So don't think that Brooklyn doesn't have farms, and obviously they're not huge farms, but there are farms in Brooklyn. Yay! Okay, so when we talk about farming, as I mentioned before, it's gone through a lot of changes. And right now, what we look at, most farming is done through industrial agriculture. Meaning that it's been mechanized and standardized. And mechanization just means that machines are now used to make things easier. It's not just like 10 people out there growing food and harvesting food, it's machines doing it. And standardization means most farms are doing this kind of farming. It's like across the United States, this is the standard, this is how we're doing it. So that's really how we make our food now, is industrial agriculture. And we obviously have to acknowledge the energy that you need to run a farm, because it's not something that's very eco-friendly. It doesn't have a zero eco-footprint. It has a pretty large eco-footprint. In the United States alone, there's 10 calories of energy required, or an energy input, for every 1 calorie that you eat. So all the food you're eating requires more energy than it has to make it. And this is largely because fossil fuels go into our food, into farming our foods, into the fertilizers and pesticides, into making them. Obviously to operate the tractors and the machines, to irrigate the land, and to transport all the food that we eat, we need fossil fuels. So there is a very large energy or fossil fuel footprint for farming. So when we talk about farming in America, we have to talk about subsidies as well. Oh, not that yet. We have to talk about subsidies, which is just an amount of money given by government to a company or an industry to help make their products cheaper. And most of the food in the United States is subsidized. Farming is largely subsidized, but I think that this image here is actually really interesting. So you have federal subsidies for food production, that's this pyramid, and then you have federal nutritional recommendations. So these are both government pyramids. If you look at this pyramid, though, most of government subsidies go to the meat and dairy industry, and very few subsidies go to vegetables. That's why your salad costs more to buy, because it costs more for a farmer to make, because they're not getting as many subsidies in these areas. But if you look at the nutritional recommendations from the federal government, a majority of the pyramid is vegetables. Tell me how that makes sense. It's confusing, right? That's our class. So something's been happening in the past 100 or so years called the Green Revolution. And I think I want you guys to start by this one here. Green Revolution is not green like environmentally friendly. It's not something that's necessarily good for the environment. But really what the Green Revolution means is, in our farming practices, we've had this huge shift to mechanization, so more machines doing jobs, using more fertilizers, better irrigation, which is what you see down here, and just general better foods, improvement in our crops and the varieties of crops we've been planting in the last 100 years. So overall, farming has become a lot stronger, a lot better. We're making better foods a lot faster and a lot cheaper. So that's something to think about, and that's called the Green Revolution. So we had, people doing all the work here. And not that people still aren't doing a lot of the work, but you go from something like this to something like this, where a machine is doing the work. And that's most of the large farms in the United States, you're going to see machines doing the work compared to people out there. So it's less jobs for people as well, and more machines needed. And that's the Green Revolution. Again, not green and environmentally friendly. It's just what we call this change in our farming practices. So I want to break down what mechanization is a little bit more, so you can understand it and how it affects farming. So there's something called economies of scale, which is really just as your output increases, as you have more farms, larger farms, more crops coming out of farms, the cost of production will fall, because we've done such a good job at mechanization, at adding massive machines that do our jobs for us on farms. Okay, so we've gotten a lot better at increasing our output, which has lowered the cost. So really just faster farming, better farming, more machine farming. leads to saving more money and just better outputs overall. But it does cost a lot to have, setups like this, to invest in this massive machinery. So there's a lot of upfront expenditures or money that you need to spend when you're starting a large mechanized farm. And people justify it because you save so much money and you make more products. So you're justifying it because your profits will increase and your production will increase. You make way more product. Sorry, this last slide's a little messy here. And the sad thing about this is that small farms can't afford all the upfront costs. If you're a local farm, the farm that I worked on could never have afforded any of these machines because it's, a small family-run farm. And the farm I worked at was a government farm, but it wasn't really a farm. So not every single farmer in America is able to spend all this money to have more output. It's just not possible. So if you look at this image here first, this is the average farm size, and I believe this is just in America. I'm not sure where this data is from. Sorry, my bad. From 1900 to 1997, you can just see the average size has increased almost 400 acres in the past 90 years. So farms are getting a lot bigger. But if you compare this to around the world, the average or mean size of farm in hectares, in America, we've got the largest farms compared to in Asia and pretty much everywhere else. So we have the largest amount of farms. We have just very large scale farms. And that's largely because we have such great mechanization and we do such a good job at farming at a large scale in America. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is monocropping or monoculture. You guys already know this word. We've seen it a couple times. And it's just this. When you grow one crop, a single species, a single variety, everywhere. It's a huge amount of one single species growing for acres and acres and acres. And that's a monoculture. So this, I honestly have no idea what this is. Let's go ahead and say it's going to be corn. Just miles and miles and miles of corn. And that's a monoculture. There are some benefits to it. People do it for a reason. It's very efficient and productive. So if you're just a corn farmer, this is the best way to grow corn. And it saves you money because you can just take these machines out and just plant row after row after row after row of corn in a couple hours, and then you're done for the season. So it saves you money, it's efficient, and highly productive. There are also drawbacks to monoculture. It really degrades soil health. There's a lot more soil erosion from adding additional fertilizers and excess water. When you're growing just one crop, you need a lot of water to keep it healthy, and you need a lot of fertilizers to make sure it's getting the nutrients it needs. So that really damages the soil, leads to soil erosion, and leads to many other negative effects that we'll get into in a few days. There's also higher vulnerability to pests. If you have just one single thing growing here, and an insect comes that loves to eat that one thing, you're kind of screwed if you're a farmer. That entire crop is going to die if the pest comes around. There's also a lot less genetic diversity when you're just growing one thing for miles and miles and miles. It's not diverse. It's just one thing, the same set of DNA over and over. So you don't have any diversity, meaning it can't fight against any threats. There's nothing, no adaptations that this crop has. It's all the exact same. So everything is going to die if something attacks it. And there's a lack of predators to combat insects and diseases and bacteria that will try and come for the crops. There's not much you can do if some sort of microscopic organism attacks your crops. You're kind of helpless. There was something in the 1970s called the corn blight. It happened in America, and it wiped out, it was a fungus that came and wiped out this one species of corn that was a hybrid, so it was a GMO species of corn, and this fungus wiped out mass amounts of this corn and caused a lot of devastation for farmers. So about 80% of farmers were using that hybrid corn. Then this fungus came around and started to wipe it out, caused a lot of devastation. So that was bad. This image is really cool. So a century ago, this is all the different varieties of all these vegetables. 285 different cucumbers, 497 varieties of lettuce. And then if you look down here, 80 years later, these are the varieties that are found in our National Seed Storage Laboratory. So all the varieties that are still being used and being shared and being stored today, well, not today, but closer to today compared to 100 years ago. Just look at beets. 288 different types of beets compared to 17. We're really changing things. We're making things less diverse. We're taking away species diversity in terms of just our food, not even animals. So something to think about. And now we're going to get into GMOs. We've done a lot of the GMO work with our movie, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Here's 10 genetically modified foods that most of us eat pretty often. So like we saw in the video, it's everywhere. It's in most of our foods. And this is a really important note that traditional artificial selection, which is just basically genetic engineering, it's been practiced for, oh, I spelled that wrong. You know what I'm trying to say. It's been practiced for thousands of years. So farmers have been kind of editing or manipulating their crops for a really long time, taking the good parts and the bad parts and kind of blending them together to create what we have today. So that exists and has existed for many years. I'm sorry the image is cut off down here, but you kind of get the idea. So just a little bit of biology for you. This is how we genetically engineer in modern times. You isolate a specific gene from one organism and you transfer it into another. So that's what's happening here. You take out the DNA you want, you cut actually the gene that you need, insert it into what's called a vector or like a host, and then you have that host reproduce a bunch of times till you get thousands and thousands of copies of what you want. So that's how we genetically engineer. You find the gene you want, insert it into, let's say, a bacteria, have that bacteria reproduce. All right, so the benefits of GMOs, they increase the quantity and quality of our food, and they also cut costs, which are great for farmers. GMOs can make pest and drought-resistant crops, which is amazing for farmers. They don't have to worry about insects and funguses coming in to wipe out the foods they're trying to sell. And if you can make drought-resistant crops, that's amazing because our world is getting hotter, we're losing water at a very rapid rate. So if our foods can adapt to that change, we're going to be better off. And because some of our foods are pest resistant, that reduces the need for pesticides. We don't have to spray for certain insects if our foods are resistant to those insects already. You can also add essential nutrients to foods through genetic engineering. So the example that the movie talked about is golden rice. So you can see golden rice right down here. Golden rice was engineered to have vitamin A in it. Oh my god, I don't know what's happening to my pen. Vitamin A helps improve vision. So golden rice was sent to areas of the world where children had issues with their vision to help them improve that. And it can also be used to manufacture hormones like insulin. So the main way we manufacture insulin is through genetic engineering. So through this process here, we take out the insulin gene, insert it into bacteria, and rapidly produce insulin. So those are just some of the benefits of GMOs. The concerns: most people are just worried about safety. What is going to happen if I eat a GMO? Am I going to get cancer? Am I going to look like a rat with a bunch of tumors on it? But like we saw in the movie, there's very little evidence that GMOs are dangerous for human health. You guys remember this guy? This is Jeffrey Smith, I think. He is kind of on board with the whole we should be terrified of GMOs, but the science says there's very little evidence that GMOs are dangerous. The only concern might be in food allergies, but that's not something that's universal. So there's just this crazy fixation on GMOs, and I think he's a great example of people becoming so concerned about GMOs, but not actually listening to the science. There's a lot of fear-mongering, and a lot of errors, and a lot of fraud in this conversation about GMOs, but just know the science. I think that's key. Always know the science. And you guys do, because you're in this class. So yeah. There's also the question of the effect of GMOs on biodiversity. So there's an idea that GMOs might start to breed or kind of trade seeds and create new species with their wild relatives. And this can alter or even eliminate the natural varieties of that species, which leads to the loss of genetic diversity. So if you have your GMO species and then your wild or natural species and you start to lose your natural species, then you're losing a lot of the genetic diversity of that plant. So let me make that a little more clear. So let's say that we have GMO tomatoes right here. So this is a field of GMO tomatoes. Tomatoes. And they're growing really close to wild tomatoes over here. I'm just going to put wild T. And eventually they start to kind of interbreed, their seeds start to mix, and you get a new or altered version of the wild tomato. So now we don't have this wild tomato in its natural form. It's been edited or changed by the GMO species as they breed it together. And then eventually maybe this wild species gets eliminated. So now, instead of 79 tomato seed species, we have 78. So you're starting to reduce that biodiversity even more, which can become a concern. So that's just something to think about as well. So last thing I want to talk about is just the regulations that we have around GMOs. There are currently no regulations in the United States that mandate or require the labeling of GMOs. The European Union and many other places in the world have banned GMOs, as we've seen in Africa, parts of Africa, they've banned GMOs, and all over Europe as well. Organic foods, which are kind of the alternative to GMOs, they don't have any GMOs. They don't contain GMO. So a lot of people are pushing for organic foods because they're scared of GMOs. And I think there's a real issue here with labeling. It confuses people who aren't really informed about these topics. They don't know the science, so they assume there might be something wrong with GMOs, or they don't know because everyone wants to buy organic food. They're all saying stay away from GMOs. You know, places around the world are banning GMOs, so they're confused. And if there's nothing wrong with GMOs, then why would we even need to label them in the first place? It would just be regular food, right? So why are we concerned about the labeling of GMOs if they're just normal foods? So again, like I've said before, this is just a lack of knowledge. People are uninformed, and that creates a lot of problems. But GMO foods are really no different than organic foods. They're normal. We eat them every day. So that's it for today. I hope you've learned something and you've enjoyed a little bit. I've enjoyed making this one. There were quite a few bloopers that I hopefully will share with you. All right. Goodbye, everyone.